So hi, I'm Mattea Roach and I'm championing the graphic memoir Ducks on Canada Reads 2023. Kate Beaton, the author and artist of Ducks, joins me now. So we'll get more into details about the book later, but first, hi Kate, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm really good, thanks.
Amazing. I'm so glad that we get the chance to have this conversation.
Yeah.
um, So I guess before we delve into sort of my questions for you about the book, I wanted to share a little bit about why I decided to champion Ducks. For me, Ducks was actually the only book that I ever really considered. I had been wanting to read it outside of doing Canada Reads anyway. And I think why I felt really initially connected to the stories because as somebody from the Maritimes who did move away, in my family, like there are so many stories of people having to leave the region, whether it's for economic reasons. In my case, it was to attend school somewhere. I think most Maritimers have these like stories of migration and displacement. And so that was something that immediately resonated with me. But there's so much else that's going on in this book that I really felt like I connected with once I started reading it. Was there like a moment where you decided, you know what, this needs to be a book? Like, this is a story that I want to tell in this form?
I don't think there was any moment like that, but first of all, I'm really honored. Thank you. It's my story and my memoir, but I always wanted to tap into that larger story that begins in the Maritimes and in the Atlantic provinces that everybody is familiar with, this kind of migratory labor that is has been going on here for many generations, and that has affected so many lives in a very like a deeply felt way. And then as soon as you get into that, you get into ideas about class and capitalism, and so much more opens up once you start tapping into that. There wasn't any particular moment that I decided that I needed to make this a book. There there were many moments, and I know that it's a natural exercise for a cartoonist to put things down this way. That's why you see so many autobiographical comics. It's a cathartic thing. It's a way to parse things that you feel very deeply. And there were memories of mine that I had sort of tumbled around in my mind so many times that they began separating themselves into panels, which is something that I think cartoonists do, especially if I could do it in a way that rang true to people who lived these same stories. And that was the most important thing, not to just put something out there, but to do it in a way that felt honest and real.
The thing that you mentioned about starting to see these memories as panels is so interesting to me because that's just, it makes total sense when you say it like that, that if you are so used to expressing yourself or to expressing thoughts in comic form, you would begin to just think that way. There's a lot of vulnerability, I think, in telling one's own story, sort of regardless of what kind of story it is. But there's a lot of stuff in this book that I think is difficult to read, and so I'm sure was also extremely difficult for you and for the people that you knew that you worked with to experience. How did it feel, you know, reflecting on that period of your life, knowing that you were going to be putting pieces of that out into the world?
That's funny because it takes so long to make a graphic novel. It took several years. So you're sitting with these sort of intimate memories and sometimes painful ones for many, many months or days that you have it in front of you, that you're writing it and then drawing different drafts of pages until the distance is sort of great enough that you are looking at yourself as a character on it. So the cumulative effect is that even though these things are hard and personal, they end up becoming somewhat distant when you're working with them in this kind of long process. And that made it a bit easier and perhaps even cathartic in its own way.
Mm-hmm.
And I did contact certain people in the book as well, because you're right, it's not just my story. It's not just things that happened to me. And they were generous about letting me tell their story as well. I never got any pushback, even when the stories went into painful territory. And I was lucky that way. You know, they could have shown me the door.
It's interesting. Yeah, I'm sure people have their own ways of making decisions like that, of is this a story that I'm comfortable even being shared by someone else? But I have to imagine that some of what you said earlier about it almost being a cathartic process to think deeply about and present, for people to hear the story of some of the things you experienced. I imagine maybe for some people that was part of why they felt it might be, okay to participate in this, or that it might be necessary or helpful for them even.
Maybe. And also it's hard for people to imagine when someone's coming up to them and saying, I'm making this book, what the finished thing is going to be. I'm making this big comic book, and they're like, sounds good. I don't know what that's going to look like in the end. I wanted to be responsible to them. I don't think anybody wants to open up a book and say, oh my God, that's me in there, without having any kind of prior warnings. So I tried to get in touch with people as much as I could to let them know, you're in here, and I'm going to change your name, and maybe I'm going to change the way you look, maybe, because nobody, I'm not that good of a cartoonist.
I think you're great, but I see what you mean. It's not like you're not doing realist photo portraits of people.
There was a lot of guys in hard hats with mustaches and like safety goggles, and my editors were like, the readers are having a hard time telling these guys apart. You have to do a better job of defining their features. And I was like, that's what every old man from the Maritimes looks like.
So true. I was kind of wondering, we talked a little bit at the beginning of the conversation about you were really hoping that, specifically people who had had similar experiences to you, the people that you worked with even directly, would feel like this book was a good representation. Beyond that, what would you want maybe readers who don't have as direct a connection to your book to take away from your work?
Around here, there in the Maritimes, there's a lot of points of connection to the oil sands. Everybody knows somebody who went out there to work, and in places where there's less of a connection to the oil sands, there's really no understanding of human life there. The real day-to-day reality of people's lives, the people inside the vehicles, is something that is not out there. You never hear narratives about the people who work in those camps or on site. It's very rare to hear about issues that affect the indigenous communities around the oil sands. And when they do, they're kind of buried in the news until the next time it comes up. I really wanted this book to go out there and open up that closed box that people don't know about, because everybody has their opinion about the oil sands, and they're entitled to it. That's fine. But they don't know about the human story that is there all the time. I hope that my book will also bring out more narratives from this industry and from around this industry, because this is just my story, but there are plenty to be told.
But one thing I really was struck by as I was reading Ducks was I felt like there was kind of a way in for people who don't have that direct connection to really feel moved by that story. I think because you're incorporating the stories of enough different folks that you worked with, and you have this also sort of representation of what it feels like to have this disconnect between people who were there with you and know what it was like, and then people who don't really know. When you're talking about the environmental degradation and like the impact on indigenous communities and all of these things, it's very abstracted. I think a lot of the time, the way that we talk about it, it's like this thing that's happening over there, and we don't really have to think about it that deeply because it's not our families that are affected. It's not our relatives that are working there.
Yeah. And that's one area where I wish I could have expanded more in the narrative, the impact on indigenous communities, but I was very young and I didn't know that much at the time. I was hoping that, once the book got out, that there would be more space for that conversation. And I'm very grateful to Selena Hart for letting me put her likeness and her words in the book to talk about the effects that the oil sands have had on the health and the environment of her community, which is Fort McKay, which is just right in the shadow of all these gigantic oil corporations, and the rare cancers that these Indigenous communities are experiencing, and that this is something that's being, denied by corporations and government. And it is very Canadian, isn't it, for most people to just sort of look away and say that they're waiting for more proof or something like that. But there's no proof coming because nobody's looking. And I don't think it's much of a leap for people from Toronto or from anywhere else who have zero connection to the oil sands to empathize with and understand the power of corporations and of working conditions that dehumanize you or take away, aspects of your humanity sometimes, because that's a working person's problem, no matter where you are. Fort McMurray is where people come to work, people with hope. A lot of immigrants come there. A lot of young families come to work there. And still there is this image of this sort of like lawless town full of ne'er-do-wells. And that's the image that they're dealing with.
Anytime I hear about whether it's like a workplace or, whether it's a government establishment or whatever it is that is so enclosed against either people who regularly work there or show up there taking photos or recording what happens there, or is so enclosed and opposed to people from outside coming in, it never leaves a great taste in my mouth, just in the sense of, what are you hiding, right? And I'm sure that there's like also serious security concerns and reasons why you need to keep people off work sites and such, but it's like, to even not allow people who do work there to document at all their experience, it just creates an environment that's so ripe for abuse.
Yes. I mean, I know you can't just let people onto like an active oil site walk around and fall in a hole and like lose their leg or something. Like, you can't just let anybody on there. I understand the security, but even among workers who went there and came home, it's my experience that they don't have a lot to say. You ask how are things out on site or whatever, and they're like, fine, it's fine. It's not like they're getting into it with you. And I didn't either. I didn't want to talk to people about it really in depth. What was I going to say? I hated it. I experienced violence. I was lonely. I was harassed. People asked me when I got home here, how'd you get along out there? And I was like, fine. I can't paint this bleak picture for everybody, but it was there. There were a lot of people who faltered and fell through cracks, and there were other people that did all right.
To sort of circle back to this whole thing of people get their backs up and get defensive, I think, in some cases, people who do have the more positive experiences, but in other cases, just people who feel like, well, why are you coming after me for basically exercising my only option to make a living? Like, where's the support for me going to be if I'm not here? Like, I think that that's a real fear that a lot of people who still live in, Fort Mac and who work in this industry seem to really have, is like, there's this real sense of like resentment, I think, against especially the federal government, but also environmentalists, also people from the East who haven't had to go out there. Like, this notion of like, you're going to take away my livelihood and you're not going to replace it with anything else. And you're kind of on your high horse about this and you don't really care about me. And I think what I liked about your book, I think because you were there, like, you have this empathy for people that feel that way and are in that position and are kind of demonstrating like, you can have like critiques about what this all represents without vilifying the people who go and make a living there. And you can have empathy for the people who go do that while also recognizing like, this is a system that they should not be forced to work in.
It's not like this is a pro oil sands book. It's neither. It's an account of my time there. the things that sat heavily with me afterwards. As far as like a book to change your mind, I think that in order to enact change in a place, and Fort McMurray, the oil sands is a place that people do want to see change. You hear that all the time. I think that first you have to care about it in a real way. And I think that a lot of the times that people who want change, they engage with sort of puppet versions of the place, with things that they know about it that are images and sound bites and things like that. And I hope that by reading my book, they will get under the surface a bit, because you want to get to know a place deeply in order to bring about change. You have to think about the reality, the harder truths, which are contradictory, and they're not easy. And that is maybe what my book presents, these kind of the kind of messiness of humanity there,